darkness, knowledge emerges.
The sky has always been wrong, and I have never known it any other way. That is the first thing you need to understand about life on Valewood Station. We are born beneath a wound in reality, and we learn to function despite the constant awareness that the universe is broken directly above our heads. My designation is Manufactorum Worker 7743 Secundus. Though my mother called me Kale before the workminders took her away for unauthorized sentiment during labor hours, before I learned that names were luxuries reserved for those who lived in places where the sky was merely sky and not a screaming tear in the fabric of existence. I am 23 years standard, which makes me ancient by local metrics, a survivor whose continued consciousness is either testament to genetic resilience or bureaucratic oversight that has not yet reclassified me as expendable. I worked, though the distinction between present and past has become increasingly meaningless in Tertiary Assembly Sector 9, where we manufactured components whose purpose we were never told, assembling pieces of machinery that would be shipped elsewhere to serve functions beyond our comprehension, our entire existence reduced to the repetitive motion of hands that attached bolt to bracket in patterns that had been drilled into muscle memory through decades of identical shifts. The breach is visible from every external viewport, from every gap in the station's superstructure where maintenance seals have failed and never been replaced. It hangs above us like a second sun, except where a sun provides light and warmth. The breach provides illumination that hurts to perceive, and a heat that has nothing to do with temperature. The tech priests who maintain what little functional equipment we still possess describe it in their binary cant as a stable warp anomaly. The word stable doing tremendous work in that designation, suggesting that the tear in reality that dominates our sky has achieved some kind of equilibrium even as it pulses with colors that should not exist and occasionally births shapes that briefly coalesce before dissolving back into the screaming chaos. I have stared at the breach for cumulative hours across my life. It is impossible not to look. Despite the warnings, despite the sanctions against observation without proper ritual preparation, and I can tell you with certainty that it is not stable in any meaningful sense. It changes. It grows. It has moods, if such a word can apply to a phenomenon that exists outside conventional physics. Some days it is merely terrifying, a constant reminder of our vulnerability. Other days it is actively hostile, reaching down with tendrils of unreality that brush against the station's outer hull and leave marks that look like corrosion but smell like screaming. We are told the breach has existed for 900 years, though I suspect the actual duration is both longer and shorter than that, time itself becoming negotiable in proximity to such sustained warp exposure. The official history, such as it is, preserved in records that contradict themselves depending on which archive you access, suggests that Valewood Station was a research facility, that tech priests and magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus were studying methods of warp travel, that an experiment went catastrophically wrong and tore open a rift that could not be closed. The researchers died, or were transformed, or escaped, depending on which version of events you hear from which elder worker during which shift when the overseer is not listening. What remained was the station itself, its structural integrity somehow preserved despite being partially extruded into the immaterium, and a population of workers, descendants of the original support staff, of the menials and servitors and low-ranking adepts who maintained the facility who had nowhere else to go and no means of leaving even if destination existed. The Imperium, in its infinite wisdom, decided that a station suspended half in real space and half in the warp was still capable of manufacturing goods, that workers born and raised in such an environment could still serve the Emperor's economy despite the minor complication of existing in a place where reality was optional and madness was ambient atmosphere. The physical sensation of living beneath the breach is difficult to articulate to someone who has never experienced it, though I assume no one will read this testimony who has not already been exposed to similar conditions, assuming anyone reads this at all, and it does not simply dissolve into the same unreality that claims everything here eventually. It begins with pressure not in your ears or sinuses like atmospheric changes, but deeper, in parts of your skull that do not have names in standard anatomical texts. The pressure is constant during childhood. A baseline condition you learn to incorporate into your sense of normal, but it increases as you age, as if accumulated exposure makes you more susceptible to whatever force the breach exerts on biological systems. By adolescence, most workers report frequent headaches that Medicaid staff cannot treat because they originate from sources that conventional medicine does not acknowledge. By your 20s, the pressure has become sharp, intrusive, demanding attention even during routine tasks. By your 30s, for the rare few who survive that long, it has transformed into something else entirely, a presence rather than a sensation, as if something is pressing against the inside of your consciousness, testing for weakness. The temperature is wrong in ways that thermometers cannot measure. The station's environmental systems maintain atmosphere within acceptable parameters according to their readouts, the temperature never deviating more than a few degrees from standard imperial baseline. But we feel heat that has nothing to do with those readings, heat that seems to radiate from the walls themselves, from the floor beneath our feet, from the very air we breathe. It is the heat of fever without infection, of inflammation without injury, of burning without flame. Some workers develop skin conditions that resemble radiation exposure despite no radiation sources being present. Others experience internal sensations of burning that Medicaid scans show no physical evidence for. I once watched a coworker collapse during shift, screaming that his blood was boiling, that he could feel it vaporizing in his veins. The temperature reading taken from his body showed normal, but when they cut him open, because cutting open was the only remaining diagnostic tool after the Auspex units began showing contradictory readings, his blood did indeed show signs of having been subjected to extreme heat, proteins denatured in ways that should not occur in living tissue. But it is the colors that truly mark you as someone who has lived too long beneath the breach. When you are born here, your eyes develop differently than they would elsewhere. We see the normal spectrum, of course, reds and greens and blues and all the variations that standard human vision perceives. But we also see others, colors that exist only in proximity to warp exposure, shades that have no names in any human language because they should not be perceivable by organic eyes. The breach itself displays these colors constantly, roiling masses of hues that shift and blend in patterns that suggest intentionality, that look almost like writing if you stare long enough, which you should never do, but inevitably will, because the colors are beautiful in ways that beauty should not be capable of achieving. I have tried to describe these colors to the occasional off-station visitor supply ship crew who dock long enough to transfer goods before fleeing back to saner space, and the words always fail. It is like purple but sharper, I once said, and the crewman looked at me with the particular pity reserved for the obviously damaged. It is like red, but it moves through dimensions that red does not occupy. I tried another time, and the recipient of this information simply nodded and backed away slowly, one hand drifting toward the stub pistol at his belt as if I might be contagious. The dreams began when I was 7 years standard, which the Medicaid staff assured my work detail supervisor was within normal developmental parameters for station-born children. Everyone who lives beneath the breach dreams, they explained, the warp's proximity ensuring that sleep never truly separates consciousness from the immaterium's influence. Most dreams are merely unsettling, familiar spaces rendered slightly wrong, known people whose faces do not quite align properly, routine activities that proceed according to dream logic that makes perfect sense until you wake and remember that logic has rules. But some dreams are different. Some dreams feel less like imagination and more like visitation, as if something from the other side of the breach has noticed you specifically and decided to examine you while your mind is vulnerable. These dreams have weight. They persist after waking, clinging to memory with adhesive strength that prevents you from dismissing them as mere neurological static. They show you things, glimpses of spaces that do not exist in real space, entities that should not possess the awareness they clearly demonstrate, truths about the station's history that contradict official records but feel more accurate than any documentation. I dreamed once of the facility as it was before the breach, saw tech priests working at machinery that hummed with barely contained power, watched as one of them made a calculation error, or perhaps followed instructions that were themselves erroneous, witnessed the moment when the experiment that should have created a controlled warp rift instead tore a permanent wound in reality's skin. But the dream did not show me what official histories claim, that the researchers died instantly, consumed by warp energies they could not contain. Instead, I saw them transform, their bodies becoming doorways, their minds fragmenting and expanding simultaneously as they were pulled partially into the immaterium while remaining partially anchored to real space. I saw them realize what they had become, saw the horror and then the terrible understanding that horror was no longer a relevant emotion for entities that existed across multiple states of being simultaneously. And I saw them look toward the camera of my dreaming perspective, because dreams have cameras apparently, viewing angles and focal points that suggest they are being shown to you rather than generated by you, and I saw recognition in their transformed faces, as if they knew that someday someone would dream this specific dream and bear witness to their metamorphosis. Work continues regardless of dreams or colors or pressure or any of the other symptoms that Marcus has damaged. The Imperium's bureaucracy does not acknowledge that Valewood Station exists in conditions that should by all reasonable assessment render it uninhabitable. Our production quotas are the same as any manufactorum in stable space, adjusted only for our smaller population rather than our compromised reality. We manufacture components, actuator assemblies. I eventually learned after years of assembling them without knowing their purpose, parts that would be incorporated into larger mechanisms elsewhere, contributing to machines whose final function remained opaque to us. The work is repetitive, mind-numbing in its monotony, which the overseers assure us is beneficial given our environment. Empty your mind of unnecessary thought, they instruct during shift briefings. Focus only on the task before you. Idle contemplation invites corruption, and they are correct, in a sense. When your hands are busy with familiar patterns, when your attention is absorbed by the immediate task of aligning bolt with bracket and applying the correct torque, there is less mental space available for noticing the wrongness, for perceiving the ways in which reality is negotiable here, for hearing the whispers that seem to emanate from the walls during quiet periods. But you cannot maintain that focus indefinitely. Attention wavers. The mind seeks stimulation beyond repetitive motion. And in those moments when concentration slips, when you glance away from your workstation toward the viewports that show the breach in all its terrible glory, when you allow yourself to truly perceive your environment rather than merely existing within it, that is when you understand how thoroughly doomed you are, how every moment of continued survival is borrowed time that will eventually be called due. I have watched co-workers break during such moments. Watched their hands stop moving, watched their eyes lock onto something only they can see, watched the recognition spread across their features as they understand something fundamental about their existence that their conditioning had previously prevented them from acknowledging. Some scream, some laugh, some simply walk away from their stations, ignoring the overseer's commands to return to work, walking instead toward the external airlocks with expressions of peaceful resignation, choosing quick death in hard vacuum over slow dissolution beneath the breach. The suicides are recorded as work-related accidents in official documentation, the paperwork stamped and filed with the same bureaucratic efficiency that characterizes all imperial administration. But we know what they are. We know that every worker who steps through an airlock without a void suit, who walks deliberately into machinery whose dangers they understand perfectly, who consumes chemicals from the manufactorum stores that are clearly labeled as toxic, these are not accidents. These are rational decisions made by rational people who have accurately assessed their circumstances and chosen termination over continuation. The overseers know this too, I am certain, but acknowledging it would require acknowledging the conditions that provoke such decisions. And acknowledging the conditions would require admitting that Valewood Station should not be inhabited, should not be operational, should have been evacuated or destroyed centuries ago, rather than perpetuated as a productive element of the Imperium's industrial capacity. My mother, I remember her as sensation rather than image, the comfort of her presence. During my earliest years before she was disappeared for the offense of nurturing rather than merely monitoring, Me used to tell me stories during the rest periods between shifts when the overseers were less vigilant. She told me that her grandmother, who had lived to the remarkable age of 47 before madness claimed her, remembered a time when the breach was smaller, when it occupied only a portion of the sky rather than dominating it completely. "It grows," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible over the constant hum of station machinery. "Slowly, so slowly that most do not notice within a single lifetime, but it grows. Each generation sees a breach slightly larger than the one before. Someday, it will consume the entire station, pull us fully into the warp, and we will cease to exist in any recognizable form." I asked her why the Imperium did not evacuate us if that was our inevitable fate. She smiled. I remember that smile, sad and knowing and utterly resigned. "Because, child, the Imperium measures value in production, not in lives. As long as we continue manufacturing components, as long as our output meets quotas, our suffering is an acceptable cost. We are not citizens to be protected. We are resources to be exploited until we are exhausted." She was taken 3 days after that conversation. I do not know by whom, overseers or enforcers, or perhaps something worse, entities that wear human form but serve purposes that human language cannot articulate. I never saw her again. Her workstation was occupied the next shift by someone else, her designation reassigned, her existence erased from official records as if she had never been. I continued working because there was no alternative, because stopping meant being noticed, and being noticed meant disappearing like she had, because survival, even in this compromised form, was preferable to whatever fate awaited those who were removed from the general population. And I learned to do what she had taught me, to function despite the wrongness, to perform my duties while acknowledging internally that every shift might be my last sane shift, that the creeping madness that claimed all long-term station residents might choose tomorrow or next week or next year to finally assert itself fully. The physical mutations are impossible to hide beyond a certain point, though we try. The first changes are subtle, a faint luminescence in the eyes that is only visible in certain lighting, a tendency for wounds to heal in patterns that resemble symbols rather than random scarring, fingers that occasionally bend in directions that standard joints should not permit. We conceal these when possible, wearing tinted goggles that we claim reduce glare from workstation lights, keeping our hands gloved and our bodies covered despite the heat, avoiding close inspection by overseers who have their own subtle mutations and understand the implicit agreement not to look too closely at each other's deterioration. But eventually the changes progress beyond concealment. Skin develops textures that resemble scales or bark or surfaces that have no terrestrial analog. Bone structure shifts, creating protrusions or depressions that alter silhouettes in noticeable ways. The colors we perceive begin to manifest visibly, our bodies developing patches that display the impossible hues we have been seeing in the breach, as if prolonged observation has taught our cells to replicate what our eyes witness. When the mutations become undeniable, when a worker's transformation has progressed to the point where they can no longer pass as baseline human, they are reassigned to the deep sections. No one speaks directly about what happens in the deep sections. Doing so invites the attention of overseers who respond to such discussions with immediate and terminal sanctions. But we know from observation, from the patterns of disappearance, from the sounds that sometimes emanate from the lower levels during shift changes when the manufactorum machinery briefly quiets. The deep sections are where the most transformed reside, where workers who have been rendered too altered for normal duties continue to serve the station in capacities that do not require human appearance or perhaps even human consciousness. We hear them sometimes grinding sounds that might be machinery or might be vocalization from throats that have been restructured beyond the capacity for human speech, rhythmic pounding that might be industrial equipment or might be transformed limbs performing labor that baseline humans could not survive. I am beginning my own transformation. I have hidden it for 6 months now, but the changes are accelerating. My left hand has developed an extra joint in each finger, giving me grip strength and dexterity that baseline anatomy does not permit, but also creating a profile that is distinctly wrong when observed carefully. The skin of my forearms has taken on a faint translucency, showing structures beneath that resemble veins but branch in patterns that do not correspond to standard circulatory systems. Most concerningly, I have begun to perceive things that should not be perceptible, movement in the corners of my vision that resolves into nothing when I turn my head, voices in frequencies that standard human hearing should not register, the sense of presence in empty spaces that observation confirms are unoccupied. I know what this means. I know that my time in the primary manufactorum sections is limited, that soon an overseer will notice what I can no longer fully hide, that I will join the others in the deep sections and discover what service I can provide in my altered state. But before that happens, I am writing this testimony. I do not know who will read it, perhaps no one, perhaps only entities whose relationship to consciousness and text is nothing like human reading. But I write because recording has value independent of readership, because documentation is the last small rebellion available to someone whose entire existence has been constrained by circumstances beyond their control. I write to testify that we existed, that we were human once, that we suffered in ways the Imperium's bureaucracy never acknowledged and its propaganda actively denied. I write to bear witness to the doomed life of workers born beneath a permanent warp breach, to ensure that someone, somewhere, knows that Valewood Station was inhabited by people with thoughts and feelings and the capacity for suffering, not merely by productive units whose degradation was an acceptable cost of maintaining quotas. The breach is pulsing now. I can see it through the viewport near my assigned bunk, its colors shifting through the impossible spectrum with increased frequency, its edges fraying in ways that suggest imminent expansion. The pressure in my skull has intensified to the point where thought requires deliberate effort, where each sentence of this testimony must be forced through interference that seeks to prevent its completion. My hands ache, the transformed joints grinding against each other in ways that will soon make delicate assembly work impossible. The heat that has nothing to do with temperature has increased until my skin feels like it is burning constantly, though scans would doubtless show normal readings, the instruments unable or unwilling to acknowledge conditions they are not designed to measure. I have perhaps days before the transformation progresses beyond concealment, perhaps hours. Time has become slippery, moments stretching or compressing without warning, the clocks showing durations that do not correspond to subjective experience. I worked a shift that the chronometer claimed lasted 8 hours, but that felt like weeks. Every moment extended into subjective infinity while I assembled components with hands that were becoming less human with each repetition. I slept a rest period that lasted 30 minutes according to official measurement, but that contained dreams spanning what felt like years, elaborate narratives of transformation and revelation that I can no longer fully recall but that left impressions ground deep into memory. The voices have become distinct. They no longer whisper from walls or machinery, they speak directly, their words forming in my mind without requiring the intermediate step of sound. They are not hostile, which is perhaps more unsettling than if they were. They speak with the patient interest of researchers observing an experiment, commenting on my transformation with clinical detachment, occasionally offering observations about what I am becoming and what capacities I will possess once the metamorphosis completes. You will see, truly, one voice assures me, its tone conveying something that might be kindness, if kindness could exist in contexts where all human reference points have become obsolete. You will understand what you have been perceiving all these years. The colors are not colors, the pressure is not pressure. They are attempts by your limited senses to interpret phenomena that your species lacks the neurology to properly process, but you are being upgraded. You are being granted senses that will allow direct perception rather than crude approximation. I do not want to be upgraded. I want to remain human, limited though that state may be. But wanting is irrelevant. The transformation proceeds according to its own schedule, indifferent to my preferences, reshaping me into something that can survive and function in proximity to the breach in ways that baseline humanity cannot. The voices assure me that this is beneficial, that I should be grateful for the opportunity to transcend my original limitations. But gratitude requires choice, and I have had no choice in any aspect of my existence, not in being born here, not in the work I was assigned, not in the exposure that has marked every cell of my body with the warp's touch, not in the transformation that is now reaching its inevitable conclusion. The deep sections are calling. I can hear them now, not through my ears but through senses that are still developing, still learning to interpret signals they were never designed to receive. There is work being done down there, labor that serves purposes I will understand only after I join those who perform it. The thought fills me with horror, But also, and this is perhaps the most disturbing aspect, with curiosity. Part of me wants to know what lies in those lower levels, what my transformed colleagues do in spaces where human observers never venture, what purpose we serve that requires our systematic mutation and deployment into conditions that would kill anyone who retained baseline physiology. My shift begins in what the chronometer claims is 4 hours. I will report to my station as always, will perform my assembly duties with hands that are becoming less suitable for such work with each passing day, will maintain the pretense of normalcy until the overseer inevitably notices what can no longer be concealed. And then I will be taken down into the deep sections, down to where the station's hull is thinnest and the breach's influence strongest, down to where workers are transformed not gradually but rapidly, not partially but completely, where whatever we are becoming can finally manifest without the constraints of trying to maintain human appearance. I am afraid. This testimony is written in fear, marked by it in every sentence, shaped by the terror of someone who knows their humanity is ending and can do nothing to prevent it. But beneath the fear is something else, resignation, perhaps, or acceptance, or simply exhaustion with fighting against an outcome that was determined before I was born. I am a worker born beneath a permanent warp breach. My life was doomed from its beginning, my fate sealed by circumstances I had no part in creating. Every day I remained human was borrowed time. Every shift I completed with baseline anatomy was a small miracle of denial and willpower. But all debts come due eventually, and mine is being called now. The breach pulses again, and this time I see something within it, not the random patterns and impossible colors that usually characterize its appearance, but shapes, defined forms, entities that might be daemons or might be something else entirely, residents of that space between real space and the immaterium that Valewood Station has occupied for 9 centuries. They are watching. They have always been watching, I realize now, observing the slow transformation of the station's population with the interest of shepherds tending a flock that is being prepared for purposes the flock cannot comprehend. We are not victims of an industrial accident that the Imperium is callously exploiting. We are an experiment, deliberate and ongoing, testing what happens to humans subjected to sustained warp exposure, documenting the transformations that result, perhaps preparing for larger-scale applications of whatever principles our suffering has revealed. This is the true horror, the realization I have been avoiding throughout this entire testimony, because acknowledging it requires confronting the complete futility of resistance. We were never meant to be saved. The breach was never going to be closed. Valewood Station serves a purpose beyond manufacturing actuator assemblies, and that purpose requires a population that is slowly being transformed by proximity to the warp, that is developing adaptations to conditions that should be lethal, that is becoming something new through generations of exposure and mutation. We are not workers enduring unfortunate circumstances. We are raw material being processed into a final product, and our suffering is not an acceptable cost, it is the intended mechanism of transformation. My hands are shaking too badly to write much longer. The extra joints in my fingers are making it difficult to grip the stylus with anything approaching normal dexterity. The text I am producing is becoming increasingly illegible. I can see that even through vision that is starting to fragment into multiple simultaneous perspectives, each one showing me the page from a slightly different angle, as if my eyes are no longer quite synchronized. The voices are growing louder, more insistent, telling me it is time, that I have delayed long enough, that the deep sections are waiting, and I should not resist what I cannot prevent. I will go. Not because I have accepted my fate. I will die human in mind if no longer in body, will retain the capacity for horror at what I am becoming, even if I lose the capacity to prevent it, but because remaining here, trying to hide transformations that are becoming undeniable, will only prolong suffering without changing outcomes. Better to descend now, while I can still walk, while I still possess enough of my original consciousness to observe and record what happens in those lower levels, while some fragment of the person I was can witness the person I am becoming. This is my testimony. This is the record of a doomed life lived beneath wrongness, of consciousness persisting despite conditions that should have destroyed it, of humanity clinging to itself, even as the warp's touch reshapes everything it means to be human. If anyone reads this, any baseline human untouched by the breach's influence, understand that we were people once. We had lives, however constrained and monitored and directed toward the Imperium's purposes. We had thoughts and dreams and the capacity for hope, even in hopeless circumstances. We suffered, and our suffering mattered even if the systems that should have acknowledged it chose instead to ignore it in service of maintaining production quotas. I hear footsteps approaching my bunk. The overseer has come for me, earlier than my shift would normally begin, which means they have noticed, which means the pretense is over. The transformation has progressed beyond concealment, and I am being summoned to the deep sections where workers go and do not return, where mutation completes and service continues, in forms that baseline humans cannot witness without sanity damage. I am putting down the stylus. I am standing. The overseer is wearing full void suit despite the atmosphere being stable, which suggests that whatever they see when they look at me now is sufficiently altered that they require protective equipment. They are not speaking, just gesturing toward the corridor, toward the access hatch that leads down into sections that standard station maps do not include, because acknowledging their existence would require acknowledging their purpose. I am walking. Each step feels wrong, my gait shifted by changes in bone structure and muscle placement that have accumulated over months of gradual transformation. The corridor is the same corridor I have walked thousands of times. But it looks different now. I can see the warp's influence in the walls, can perceive how the breach's proximity has warped the station's structure in ways that physical inspection would not reveal, how we exist in a space that is not quite real space and not quite warp, but something between, something liminal and unstable and constantly shifting between states. The hatch is opening. I can see darkness beyond, illuminated by colors that should not exist. I can hear sounds that might be machinery, or might be voices, or might be both simultaneously. I can smell something that reminds me of the breach's scent, not burning or decay, but something else, something my vocabulary lacks words for, something that suggests transformation is not ending but accelerating, that what happens in the deep sections is not death but metamorphosis into something that can survive conditions that would obliterate baseline humanity. I am descending. The hatch is closing above me. The light from the main sections is fading, replaced by the impossible luminescence of the deep sections, by colors that paint the walls and floor and ceiling in hues that hurt to perceive, but that I can no longer look away from because they are beautiful in ways that beauty should not be capable of achieving. I can see others now. Workers who were taken before me, transformed beyond recognition but still somehow present, still conscious, still serving purposes I'm beginning to understand as the voices in my head grow clearer, as the final barriers between my consciousness and the warp's influence dissolve, as I become what I was always meant to become, what all of us born beneath the breach were destined to become. This is where the testimony ends. Not because I choose to stop writing. I no longer possess hands capable of holding a stylus, though I possess appendages that serve other purposes, but because the transformation is complete, because the person who began this document no longer exists in any form that could continue it. What remains is something else, something new, something that serves the station and the breach and purposes that transcend the Imperium's simple need for manufactured components. We are the workers born beneath a permanent warp breach. This was our doom, and it has been fulfilled. And now we serve, transformed and aware, and forever trapped in this space between realities, manufacturing not actuator assemblies but something far more complex, something the Imperium needs without acknowledging that need, something that will eventually spread beyond Valewood Station to other facilities, other populations, other worlds where the warp's touch can do its necessary work. The breach is not growing by accident. It is being fed, and we are its food, its transformers, its agents of expansion, and we cannot scream because we have no mouths. But we remember being human, and that remembering is the cruelest aspect of this damnation.